Good afternoon. My name is Natalie Westfall, Vice President of Henry Schein Financial Services. Since the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, Henry Schein has been a trusted source of valuable information for our customers. We've provided real-time updates on the CARES Act stimulus package and funding availability through the Small Business Administration. We've helped many of our customers access funding through the Paycheck Protection Program. The Paycheck Protection Program saw unprecedented demand by small businesses impacted by COVID-19, primarily because up to 100% of the principal amount may be forgiven if the proceeds are used on qualifying expenses. There's been a lot of confusion on the rules of PPP loan forgiveness, and our goal today is to help you better understand the current guidelines, as well as steps you should be taking if you have received PPP funding. I will now turn it over to Grassi Advisors, Jeff Agranoff, Consulting Principal, and Lou Pizzoleo, Partner, to lead our discussion on PPP loans and loan forgiveness.
Thank you, Natalie. We greatly appreciate it. This is Jeff Agranoff from Grassi, and I'm here with my partner, Lou Pizzoleo, and we are very excited to work with the Henry Schein family to help everyone better understand all the components of the Payroll Protection Program, and most importantly, the forgiveness components that we know are a very important facet for many of you that either are about to get funded with their loan or already have been funded. Hopefully, most of you are in the position where if you didn't get funded in the first tranche, you have been approved and about to be funded under the second program that came out. For those of you that still have not been funded or have not applied, there is still time to be able to do so. And under this last component, some of the banks are still offering different options, and there'll be an ability to hopefully continue to do that over the next several days or even over the next several weeks. Once you have received that loan funding, there are a number of components and planning that needs to be done. Today, we will go through some of that planning and the projection work that many of you should be able to go through even once you're funded, and again, maximize the potential of the loan during the next 8 weeks that you have it. There's also been a couple areas around the certification process that we will discuss today. Hopefully should not be a significant issue for many of you, but there has been a lot of additional attention being put on the certification process of the PPP loans. When you do sign up for that loan, that is a component of that program that is saying that you must use the loan proceeds to be able to fund your business, the people and the attainable operations of the process as well, and not have significant assets to be able to fund it without the loan. May 14th is a very important day that will be coming up, which is one last opportunity for businesses and operations that believe they do not meet the certification process. You will have the opportunity to return the loan and have no additional penalty placed in you if you return it by that date. And again, we will answer some questions for all of you at the end about if you are a business or an operation that you should be concerned about that next certification date. May 14th is also a very important date coming up because we believe there will be additional information from the SBA and from the Department of Treasury of some of the rules and new additions of the forgiveness components. Those will be very important to continue to track. And we at Grassi and through the Henry Schein family will update you after any additions are made on that date. There's a lot of questions answered, but there's many that are not. We will go through the questions that we believe have been answered and also be able to give you more information of where we believe the SBA and the Department of Treasury is going with some of the forgiveness options and actually how to fill out the forgiveness applications and all the information you'll need to know for that. As I mentioned, I have my partner Lou Pizzoleo with me, who will now go through the overview of the operations of the forgiveness and give you some real life examples that we'd like to go through with all of you, and it will help click and better understand how you'll work some of those components. So Lou, I'd like to hand it off to you.
Thanks, Jeff. As Jeff mentioned, there's been a lot of dialogue from the SBA and Treasury over the past few weeks. Most of that dialogue has been around the certification that the current economic uncertainty makes the loan request necessary to support the ongoing operations of the applicant. and other items and additional guidance in the form of new FAQ questions that were really meant to ensure that the PPP program is reserved for those who need it most. What I hope to take you through today is the operation of the forgiveness of the PPP loan. The guidelines are not out yet. We've been patiently awaiting the guidelines for forgiveness. So what I'm discussing today is the interpretation of Section 1106 of the CARES Act, and we're interpreting an act for which the guidelines haven't yet been written. So we do know a lot, but I'll just caution that the operation of the forgiveness that we're speaking through is an interpretation, and you should view it as that. Once the guidelines are available, we hope to do some subsequent webinars and true up any differences between the interpretation of the act and the guidelines. One of the things that has been talked about quite a lot is the requirement that the Treasury introduced that wasn't in the original CARES Act to spend a minimum of 75% of the PPP loan proceeds on payroll costs, which will then give you the ability to spend the other 25% on non-payroll costs. And there's been a lot of confusion on that item. So I guess I'll start by maybe going through that and then go into detail of the operation of forgiveness. So the CARES Act was introduced. Section 1106 talked about forgiveness of the PPP loan. And in one of the Treasury's interim rules that they introduced the concept of the 75-25 concept. And there's two operations of it. The first is that the loan proceeds are allowed to be spent on certain categories of expense, and those similar to the categories that were discussed in loan size, they include payroll cost, which was part of the loan size, but they also include some items that are non-payroll costs that weren't included particularly in the loan size, because the loan size was driven off of 2.5 times your average monthly payroll costs. And the reason that they weren't specifically included is because the Treasury's intent was to cover 8 weeks of payroll costs, but provide a loan size for 2.5 times that cost, which means the delta between the 8 weeks and 2.5 times average monthly was meant to cover these other costs. And those other costs are pre-committed to rent costs that for which commitments predated February 15th, 2020. To the extent you own your facility or finance equipment in a mortgage type arrangement, the mortgage interest on those debt instruments is an allowable cost. Utilities, and they define utilities relatively broadly. It's the things you would typically think of, but there's some things in there that are a little more broad, and I'll just read you the definition. The term covered utility payment means payment for service for the distribution of electricity, gas, water, transportation, telephone, or internet access. So all the things you would typically think of: heat, light, water, power. But transportation sticks out as particularly interesting and is quite broad. The last thing that was allowable, and this is causing some confusion because while it's allowable, it is not a forgivable expense, is business interest. So while you can spend the loan proceeds over the 8 weeks or after the 8 weeks on business interest, that's not one of the forgivable expenses. And we'll get into that a little bit further down the line. So the way that the loan proceeds operate is based on this 75-25 concept or mechanism that the Treasury introduced. When you spend 75 cents on payroll, you can spend another 25 cents on non-payroll costs. So that operates throughout the life of the loan. It also operates in that fashion inside the forgiveness operation, but it operates that way through the life of the loan. So I guess let me get a little bit into the details of forgiveness. So You receive your PPP loan, you celebrate for a real short period of time, and then you start thinking about how to maximize the forgiveness. And the way the CARES Act was introduced was in the form of a 7A loan that really was a loan in disguise. It was a grant disguised as a loan. And what Section 1106 said was that if you maintain your full-time equivalents and you don't reduce pay for those earning under 100,000 more than 25%, then the government will will cover your 8-week costs in the form of forgiveness of that loan. And those costs include the things you were just talking about: the payroll costs, which is cash compensation limited to $100,000 on a pro rata basis. So that works out to about $15,384 per employee during that 8-week period. You're also employer paid healthcare costs, your employer paid retirement costs, and then, while not significant, any employer portion of state and local payroll taxes, things like New York State disability and things of that nature. On top of that payroll costs, you also have the ability to get forgiveness for rent, mortgage interest, and utilities during that 8-week period. And they need to be both, the way the CARES Act is written right now, they need to be both incurred during the 8-week period and paid during the 8-week period. Our belief is that further guidance will clarify what that actually means. But as it's currently written, what that would cause you to do is somewhat interrupt your payroll cycle. So let's say at the end of the 8 weeks, you had a payroll period ending for which you hadn't paid until after the 8 weeks. Right now, in order to achieve loan forgiveness, you would need to pay that inside the 8-week period. So you would have to accelerate the pay date on that payroll period to inside the 8-week period. Same thing for rent and for mortgage interest and for utilities. It's not likely that the typical cycles will match up with your 8-week period, and that's the 8 weeks after loan proceeds. So it's very unlikely that they would match up exactly, and you'll have cutoff issues at the beginning and the end, which you have to allocate and change and interrupt pay cycles. We don't believe that was the intent here. We think it's sort of something the Treasury or the legislature has overlooked, and we think that guidelines will be introduced to sort of modify or correct that thought. But right now, it's the loan forgiveness operation is for those qualified expenses that are incurred and paid inside the 8-week period after your loan was funded. The other thing I mentioned at the start, which is very important, is those costs that you spend will be forgiven on a dollar for dollar basis to the extent that you maintain your full-time equivalent headcount and you maintain salaries for those earning under 100,000. You can't reduce those more than 25%. So let's talk about that for a minute. The FTE requirement, full-time equivalent, which the CARES Act hasn't quite yet defined, but for which we've taken interpretations from other acts to mean that those, one employee working 30 hours is a full-time equivalent, or a group of employees accumulating 30 hours, a group of part-timers accumulating 30 hours can be one full-time equivalent as well. So you compare your baseline periods. Now, those periods you get to choose. There's one of two choices. Your first baseline period is February 15th of 2019 to June 30th of 2019. So it would be your average full-time equivalents during that period. The way that you would do that is you would look at each payroll period, you would calculate the number of FTEs, you'd add those all up and then divide by the number of payroll periods. That would give you your average FTE in that baseline. The other baseline is January and February of 2020. So let's say you had a growing business and you added employees between those two periods, you're likely going to pick the earlier period. If for some reason you had a larger amount in 2019 than you did in the beginning of 2020, you're obviously going to use 2020 as your baseline. So it's one or two baselines. So you select your baseline, and then let's say that baseline was 10. During your 8-week period, if you want to achieve 100% loan forgiveness on what you spend in that 8-week period on those qualified expenses, you need to either maintain 10 FTEs on an average basis, or this is the thing that's causing quite a bit of confusion as well, or restore those FTEs by June 30th of 2020. So let's say during the 8-week period, you now have 5 FTEs on average. If you don't change anything before June 30th, you would only receive 50%, 50 cents on the dollar of the qualified expenses during the 8-week period. It's the 5 divided by the 10 in your baseline, which would be 50%. If, let's say, your 8-week period ran out mid-June, which is not practical at this point because most people got funded later than that, but let's say it did, for instance, your 8-week period ends, you're getting ready to submit your application for loan forgiveness with the financial institution that you got the loan from, and all of a sudden businesses turn back on and you rehire all your employees and you get back up to 10 by June 30th. That differential will create an additional 50 cents on the dollar for you during your loan forgiveness. It's the same operation for pay cuts. So you need to look at your payrolls the quarter prior to when you received the PPP loan. And for employees that were earning under $100,000 on a pro rata basis a year in that sort of prior quarter, to the extent you reduce salaries for those people more than 25%, you would lose those dollars in your loan forgiveness. So let's say you had an employee earning $100,000, you reduced him down to, on a pro rata basis in that 8-week period, to $74,999. $1 of your loan forgiveness in that 8 weeks would be a penalty. Same thing like the FTEs. If you restore those salaries prior to June 30th, then that penalty doesn't operate. So that's the sort of basis of how loan forgiveness operates. We have a couple of examples that I'd like to take you through, and they build off some examples that we talked about in the loan forgiveness webinars that we had done. But the way that I built these is so that we can talk about them to folks that hadn't attended those or hadn't had the opportunity to hear those. So the first example is a loan size calculation. So you have the sort of the recap of this company, DPI 2. And you'll see when you look at the example, this company has 6 employees and 5 full-time equivalents. There's 2 part-timers that make up 30 hours and they count as 1 full-time equivalent, but they count as 2 employees. So you have 6 employees and 5 full-time equivalents. You'll see that there's a bunch of payroll costs accumulated: salary, bonus, commission, total payroll costs, and then the $100,000 cap operates so that the payroll costs over $100,000 aren't included in the loan size calculation. You'll see there's employer health insurance and employer retirement added to that to get to a total which equals $532,225 in the example. That amount is then divided by 12 to come up with an average monthly payroll, and then it's multiplied by 2.5. So it results in a loan size, a maximum loan size of $110,880. Then I want to take you through the timeline. So we're going to present a timeline that takes you through the important dates in loan forgiveness considerations, and it works with the loan size calculation that we just showed you. You'll see in the earlier part of the example, which we call baseline 1, the company has 5 FTEs, and that's through the end of 12/31/19. It's similar to what was in our loan size example. What happens then is the business closes as a result of COVID. 2 employees had already left prior to that happening. During that time, after the business is closed, Hamilton is let go. So the business drops to 2 FTEs. And then on 5/1/2020, it had applied and receives the PPP loan in the amount of $110,000. So during that 8 weeks, after the loan was funded, there's only 2 FTEs. You'll see in the next example we put up, which goes into the dollars and how the loan forgiveness would be calculated here. If Hamilton wasn't brought back prior to June 30th, they would lose 33% of the loan dollars that they spent in that timeline. So this is where managing the forgiveness calculation and workforce management really comes into play. It's a business decision here of I'm spending dollars on payroll, whether my business hopefully is open, or if it's closed, you may have chose to do the same. And then the question is, how do I manage those FTEs in that 8-week period or by the June 30th to maximize my loan forgiveness? And really what we'll talk about later when we go through the best practices, and Jeff will jump in, is it's really important to forecast in that 8-week period, week by week, so that you can make the necessary business decisions and do 2 things. One, maximize loan forgiveness, but also consider the working capital needs of your business. That should be the number 1 priority, is really consider the working capital needs of your business. The loan forgiveness is great, but if the loan's forgiven and you don't have enough working capital after this 8-week period, there's really no point. So the objective here is sustainability of the business, sustainability of the jobs in the business. So it's important to make the right business decisions while also maximizing the loan forgiveness. So in this example, we brought back Hamilton, on the 29th, just prior to June 30th, and they achieved the 100% because their FTEs just prior were 3. You'll see in baseline 2 at January and February of 2020, they were 3. When they got the loan, they were only 2. So during the period, they only spent money on the 2. So you'll see the dollars were much less than the loan size, but because of the fact that they brought back Hamilton just prior to June 30th, instead of getting 66% of what they spent, they're going to get 100% of what they spent, which is that's really where this workforce management comes into play. So let's go into the next example, which is the PPP loan forgiveness example. You'll see it looks a lot like the loan size calculation, except there's columns for each of the 8 weeks and the payroll costs. You'll see the 2 FTEs get paid during the 8 weeks. That's your 2 part-timers, Jefferson and Grant. They count as 1 FTE, and then Abraham Lincoln. And during the 8 weeks, we paid them a total of $11,538. Now, the cap doesn't operate here because those 3 individuals were making less than $100,000. But if there were individuals making more than a pro rata $100,000, we would have to cap it at the $15,384 that I mentioned before. We add in the employer paid health insurance that we paid during that 8-week period. Same thing with the 401k match that we paid during that 8-week period. And we come up with a total of $34,954. So that's the total which was spent. Then we on payroll costs, sorry. Then we add rent and utilities. And that total is, that total is 46. This is close to 47,000. However, because those rent and utilities, that 10,000 and the 2,000 are slightly more than the 75-25 operation, this amount is reduced to a maximum of 46,605, which is slightly less than was spent. Now, given the FTE reduction, if we didn't bring Hamilton back and we were penalized for that to that 66%, the total amount of forgiveness would be $31,070, which is only the 66% of what was spent, limited to the 75-25. But should they bring them back on the 29th, they'll get the full 46,605. So as you can see, it's a little bit tedious, somewhat complicated. Our counsel is to map out your spend on a week-by-week basis, both payroll, the health insurance, the 401k, the rent, the utilities, mortgage interest if it's in there. And by mapping it out, you can do quite a few things. One, make sure that for the expenses that you incurred in the 8 weeks, that you actually pay them in the 8 weeks and preserve the ability to have those forgiven. but also you'll be able to map out significant business decisions of workforce management or cash flow forecasting after the loan is forgiven or not forgiven. And that's really what's important here. I think, lots of small businesses and medium-sized businesses took these loans. I know right now there's a dialogue in Congress and the legislature around the 8-week period. We talked a lot about this 8-week period in forgiveness. Many businesses are still in forced closures and may not be open during the 8-week period. Should those businesses pay their employees to maximize loan forgiveness, even though the businesses are closed? That's sort of a business and an ethical question, one that each business owner needs to make on their own. But ultimately, if at the end of 8 weeks, that business owner is out of cash and the business is still not open and opens thereafter, you have to ensure as a business owner that you have enough working capital at that point to continue on your business. If paying those employees threatens that, then you may make a different decision. But the only way to evaluate that is to really build a tedious week by week cash flow forecast so that you can make those decisions, early rather than late, and achieve that balance of, what's the right business answer and maximizing loan forgiveness. So the next thing that we'd like to talk about are some best practices, and I mentioned them as I was going through it, so it's a little bit of a cat's out of the bag already, but this forecasting is a very important tool in getting to the right answers for your business, both for forgiveness and for workforce management. Jeff, maybe you want to jump in and talk a little bit about.
I will. Yeah, thank you, Lou. So a couple things to keep in mind with employees coming back is, as Lou mentioned, he's correct. You have to make a business decision on the need to bring back all of your people, or obviously some of your people, or even people at reduced work hours. We generally are recommending that you only employ people that you believe will have a full workload, or at least a consistent partial workload during that time. There have been issues in many states where unemployment in a lot of cases have been close to lucrative, if not even more lucrative than what some employees, especially your mid-level earners, have been making. And in some cases, it might be more prudent for you to just let them continue to be on unemployment. However, when people do need to come back to work and your business reopens, whether partially or on a full scale, please keep in mind that your employees are obligated to come back to your workplace when you have given them a date of return. If they don't, you as an employer have the right to contest their unemployment at that point, and they will no longer be eligible for their traditional unemployment and then the pandemic unemployment, which is the infamous $600 extra per week. Again, you could be a nice person and decide not to contest it and let them continue to collect, the enhanced unemployment as well, but you do have that right, and that situation has come up consistently over the last couple of weeks. So when an employee does not come back and you decide to contest, their unemployment insurance, we could get into some of the mechanics of how you would take care of that on the forgiveness application, where if you offer employment back to someone and they refuse to come back, that actually will not be held against you when you're doing your forgiveness calculations. And that was an updated FAQ that came out about a week ago. So that's another important thing to note. But as Lou has mentioned, continue to track the employees you're bringing back, when you're bringing them back, how much of that money you're spending on payroll costs. And again, the key is also to try to get back to your employee count to your measured period by June 30th, if you can, if it makes business sense. And if you don't, there's obviously different strategies on how to work around that as well.
And the other thing to keep in mind is the mechanism for loan forgiveness is going to be an application process that happens through the financial institution that you receive the loan through. That process is still being worked out by the Treasury and those financial institutions. The CARES Act did provide some guidance on the types of documentation that they would need to review to ensure that those expenses were incurred and paid. So the other best practice, in addition to managing your FTEs to the baseline and making wise business decisions based on sort of planning out your business on a week by week period is, start accumulating all the documentation around those expenses. So if there's a lease agreement, put that in a file, whether it's electronic or hard copy, that's up to you. As you pay the rent related to that lease agreement, keep the check copy, keep the bank statement that shows an ACH. If there's an invoice, keep the invoice. Accumulate all that documentation in one place. Your payroll records, the payments related to those, utility bills, the payments related to those, your mortgage statements, the payments related to those. Accumulate that all in one place. That way, when your 8 weeks is over, you have a mechanism to both create a summary of that, which you should do contemporaneously during that 8 weeks, which, your forecast puts you in a good position to do that. You've sort of done it already. Now you're just sort of clicking off from forecast to actual. But then all the documentation around that as well, because it is very highly likely that as part of the application, you will have to upload that summary and all the invoices and payment support like you would in a audit scenario to the bank so that they can make an evaluation. And then the act gives them 60 days to decide whether the loan is forgiven or not forgiven and how much is forgiven. So that contemporaneous documentation is important. You'd hate to be 8 weeks from it and have to go through a process of accumulating it all and maybe finding some things but not finding others. That's going to make it difficult on you and the bank. The other thing that we're advising is continue the dialogue with your advisors, your banker, your accountant, your mother-in-law, if she's a business advisor, whoever it is you use to advise you on the business. It's worth a 20-30 minute investment weekly to have a counseling session with those folks on your business. It's a trying time for most businesses. So, that type of counsel and objective advice is more important than ever during these times. So the CARES Act was ripe with other stimuluses. If you've been on previous webinars here or elsewhere, I'm sure you've heard a lot about them, but it's important to evaluate the other stimuluses that are available: the payroll tax financing, the employee retention credit, income tax incentives around net operating losses and leasehold improvements, the Section 139, which is sort of like this hazard pay, or Section 139 relates to if you give your employees additional amounts this year as a result of this, let's say a work from home expense reimbursement, or you bought them a computer or you bought them a cell phone as a result of this crisis, those expenses are deductible on your tax return in 2019. If you filed that already, then in 2020. But there's so many other stimuluses in the act. Obviously, the personal stimuluses that have been all over the news, stimuluses around tapping your 401k plan and the waiving of the early withdrawal penalty. So talk to your advisors. PPP has been the one that everybody wants to talk about, and I think it's probably the richest. But there's quite a lot of other stimuluses inside the CARES Act. And Congress and the legislator is talking about even further stimuluses that will be available to small business. So those are some of the things that we think are best practices, things you could do right now, right after you've either applied for the PPP loan or received funding.
That's great, Lou. I think we have a lot of questions that are coming in. I think we should take some of the questions. There's a lot of strategy and a lot of unique opportunities for a lot of the businesses involved with Henry Schein take advantage of. And let's address some of those questions. Natalie, would you like to share some of them?
Yes, absolutely. We have a lot of questions here. The first one is, what are further specifics about the certification deadline on May 14th, and what do I need to do now?
As I said before, the certification required the applicant to make a statement in its application that the current economic uncertainty made the loan request necessary to support the ongoing operations of the applicant. Now, the spotlight that was shined on that after sort of round two or just prior to round two of the PPP was interesting, because that certification was in the original loan application. It was one that was required to be made in good faith. It's a relatively low standard. It didn't mention anything about other financing sources. In fact, the CARES Act removed the requirement that you didn't have other non-governmental financing sources to get this 7A loan. So the 7A loan program has been around for a long time, but it always had that requirement. If you had other non-governmental sources, you wouldn't qualify for a 7A loan. Well, the CARES Act removed that. So it made it, the intention was to make PPP more broad. In an FAQ, they sort of put it halfway back in. They said, when you made that certification in good faith, you have to evaluate other sources of financing. And that was really in response to the criticism that a lot of the large public companies received. For instance, one of them did a large private offering just prior to receiving its PPP loan. There were some others that took executive bonuses prior to the PPP loan. So this sort of reaction was a response to very, very large companies that qualified for this loan, some under this sort of exception for restaurant and franchises, and some that had less than 500 employees, but also qualified, but maybe shouldn't have taken it or maybe couldn't have made that certification in good faith. So the counsel that we're giving to the marketplace is, given the ominous nature of the penalties here and given the spotlight, it was good governance prior to that, but it probably even more so now, to document contemporaneously, do it as you made the certification, those considerations that you made as the applicant to make that certification in good faith. And the things to think about is impact on your business. Was your business forced closed? Has your revenue gone down considerably as a result of that? Or even as if your business wasn't closed, it may still have gone down as a result of people just being less inclined to come to your business. What are some other things that you need to consider? Did your employees, absenteeism across all industries is at an all-time high. Employees were afraid to come in or were too sick to come in. Is there issues possibly with your supply chain? Does that create uncertainty? So there's so many considerations a borrower needs to go through to sort of document the impact, but do that now while it's fresh in your mind. Then the other part of this is create a real high level forecast to kind of address the sources and use of cash that put you in a position to need the loan. Look at cash in the business, lines of credit, other means of financing the business, and make a determination, if nothing changed, if everything changed, and somewhere in the middle, how long your business could survive in its current form without the PPP loan. If you get to a month or two, well, then you probably made the certification in good faith. If you get to a year or more, you might need to take a harder look at it. You might decide that you want legal counsel involved to create an opinion that just sort of adds additional diligence to this if you decide to keep the loan and not, go give it back by the safe harbor. So those are the types of things that we talk about in this, let's say, contemporaneous memo to support the certification.
Okay, thank you. The next question, will there be further SBA guidance on forgiveness posted on May 14th or after?
So the real answer is we don't know. My prediction was, if we didn't see it over the weekend, that the safe harbor would be moved forward. That hasn't happened yet. I think it's unlikely that additional guidance around making the certification will come out on the 13th, and that the Treasury will believe that businesses, can make an educated decision with respect to that safe harbor in a 24-hour period. That's my prediction. I have no reason other than my gut to suggest that. And that's kind of where we stand. It definitely, they've indicated that they will release additional guidance around the certification prior to the safe harbor. So we know sometime between now and the 14th, it will be available. I don't think it will be in the form of FAQs. I think it likely will be, an additional interim final rule that they've been releasing, probably specifically on this topic.
Okay, thank you. Next one. When do I need to bring my employees back? Should it be by June 30th? And can I terminate or furlough them again on July 1st?
Yeah, I'll take that one. As we stated before, right now, June 30th is the date that we all have to keep in mind. It's not the ideal date to bring people back because ideally, especially if your loan proceeds came to you earlier, you want to have your employees, if possible, there during part or all of that 8 weeks to maximize the payroll cost. But if you have not done a full reopening or can't reopen, again, the key right now is that June 30th date. There's some discussions of why Lou and I are waiting for, and all of us for final regulations, that date could be pushed back. That date could have a carrot extended to it where as long as you bring back people by June 30th, that's allowed, but they need to be employed for a certain amount of time after that. But the way it is right now is you could bring people back on that date and then the next day furlough or terminate them again, which seems to be a little bit of a loophole, but one that might be taken into account, again, if you do not need all of your staff back in your operation. So it's something we want to carefully track during the next 1-2 weeks and beyond and see how it ends up. But the other challenge with obviously bringing back furloughed people in particular, which has been a popular designation for a lot, is there's only a certain amount of time you can keep your employees on furlough and have them active on your health insurance. In particular, most health insurance programs are allowing people to stay on an active status on medical insurance for up to 90 days. But after that, that status and access to medical will change, and obviously dental and other insurances as well. So another important item we need to track, especially if there's a delay in businesses opening again.
Thank you. I think you covered this, but I wanted just to make sure. I think it's a good question. Whether, the question is, can I prepay bonuses, insurance, or other costs to my employees?
Right, you cannot. It has to be incurred and paid. So nothing can be prepaid, but there are some strategies, and Lou and I could chat about now, where you could pay and make sure that those items are incurred. And we always have several examples, but one in particular, of course, around payroll, that you want to look at the 8 weeks of the loan proceeds and see how they match up to your payroll period. And if you need to run a special payroll, especially on the back end, that's something we highly recommend. And most of the major payroll companies are allowing that to run a partial payroll so that all of it is incurred and paid in the 8 weeks. We look at things like 401k match and some other items where you can incur and pay the percentage of those programs during that time. So during the 8 weeks. So if you do a 401k match, you take 8 weeks of a 52-week program and pay and incur it at that point. And that could hold true in a lot of different areas. Lou, do you have any additional thoughts?
Yeah, I was just would on the it's a common question that comes up if an employer has a profit sharing plan that they fund once a year, or if they have a defined benefit plan that they fund once a year. How does that get into the 8 weeks? And what we would counsel is you don't want to do anything that is so far outside the scope of what you typically do that you create risk for yourself. So the example of the plan or profit share, if you make one contribution at some point in the year that's outside that 8 week period, it's not unreasonable to accelerate some of it into the 8 week period, let's say 850 seconds of it or something like that. But we think it would be unreasonable to accelerate all of it inside that 8 week period. It's important to make those decisions in the context of the intention of the act to avoid taking on additional risk for yourself. One of the other strategies that has come up, which I think is, somewhat of use in certain industries, especially in the major metropolitan areas where pay rates are higher than others. Let's say you had payroll reductions for your over $100,000 employees. You have the ability to sort of do something good for the employee by giving them back some economic value, but then also capturing that in your loan forgiveness portion. And we've seen this kind of planned in a few scenarios where an employer will now pick up the employee portion of their health care for the 8 week period or longer. which does two things. It gives the employee back that sort of economic loss from the payroll reduction, but it also allows you then to gain forgiveness for those costs because they become the employer portion of healthcare rather than the employee portion. So, there's some things like that you can do to, do good for your employees and also create some economic gain for yourself as well for the business.
Right, and alluded to your point about giving additional compensation during those 8 weeks. I think it's important to code it, especially in the payroll system, as hazard pay or some type of bonus payment that delineates why you've given them that amount. And, for record keeping standpoints, and obviously if and when the application's reviewed by the bank and or the SBA. All right, Natalie, do you have a few more questions?
Yeah, a couple more. When do the forgiveness applications need to be submitted, and what is the deadline?
So the current operation is that those would be submitted after your 8-week period, and then the bank would have 60 days to make a determination of forgiveness. That may change as further guidance comes out. Frankly, given the volume, I'm of the opinion that it likely will be lengthened. The other thing that came up actually in one of your questions is if I rehire them by 6:30, does that mean I can terminate them shortly thereafter? I think that's unreasonable given the intent of the Jeff addressed it. Currently, you could do that. It's another reason why I think there may be a lengthening of the forgiveness process. It seems to reason that there has to be, a second sort of checkpoint to prevent somebody from doing that. And if the loan's already sort of forgiven and wrapped up, within 60 days of forgiveness, it seems to reason that would need to be lengthened out to monitor that particular issue. And there's a host of other issues as well. But right now it's, apply for forgiveness right after your 8 weeks. And then within 60 days, the bank would give you their decision.
Okay, great. Thank you. And one last question. What can I use the loan for after the forgiveness period?
Sure. It's a common question that comes up, and there's a lot of confusion around it. The Treasury's guidelines released after the CARES Act includes a list of allowable expenses. Those include all the items that we talked about inside the loan forgiveness. Payroll costs, employer-paid healthcare, employer-paid retirement, the state and local payroll taxes, utilities, rent, mortgage interest. There's one other item that isn't forgivable that is included in what you could spend the money on, and that is other business interests. So any loans you had that don't fall into those, mortgage interest or things of that nature. So business interest on equipment leases and things of that nature, or lines of credit, you could also use the proceeds from the loan on those items.
Okay, great. Thank you. Well, that's all we have time for today. I'd like to thank Jeff and Lou for their time and valuable insights on this important topic. Thank you both. As you can see, there is a lot of information to consider for your business as you navigate the situation. For up-to-date information on PPP loan forgiveness, please visit the Henry Schein CARES Act site. Thank you for your participation today.